We concluded last week with these verses from John chapter 20. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Wouldn't that be the perfect conclusion to the book? Right? It would make sense that it would just stop right there. It seems like this is the end. So why is there a chapter 21? Shouldn't the credits be rolling at the end there after chapter 20? You know, if you've been to a movie recently, say you're watching it in the movie theater, are you the kind of person that will leave as soon as the credits start rolling, or do you stick around to see if maybe they put in some little scene after the credits? If you were a Marvel fan or watched some of the superhero movies in the movie theaters over the last several years, they kind of became infamous for that, right? They would put a little scene after the credits that was kind of like a teaser for one of the next movies coming up. It feels like, after John said that in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, that the credits should be rolling. So why does the book keep going? Well, maybe the reason has to do with Peter. You remember Peter, right? Where did we leave off with Peter? You know, we might be wondering, what was his last personal interaction with Jesus? We would maybe be left wondering, maybe the disciples would always be left wondering, what did Jesus think about Peter after the denials? After Peter had failed, wouldn't it be good to know how Jesus saw Peter? I mean, have you ever thought, what does Jesus think when I fail? I mean, do you ever fail? Do you ever break your promises? You come up short? Feel like you've let God down time and time again? What does God think when that happens? If that's you, if you've ever wondered that, I think there's some hope for you in today's story. You know, in this look at this personal interaction Jesus has with Peter, there's a scene being painted here, a story that sums up all of the gospel, all of the Christian life in one short narrative. So let's read the last chapter in the book of John. Would you read with me? I'm going to start in verse 1. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. He revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called Twin, Nathanael from Cana of Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and two others of his disciples were together. I'm going fishing, Simon Peter said to them. Well, we're coming with you, they told him. They went out and they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. When daybreak came, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Friends, Jesus called to them, you don't have any fish, do you? No, they answered. Cast the net on the right side of the boat, he told them, and you'll find some. So they did. And they were unable to haul it in because of the large number of fish. The disciple, the one Jesus loved, said to Peter, it is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he tied his outer clothing around him, for he had taken it off, and plunged into the sea. Since they were not far from land, about 100 yards away, the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish lying on it and bread. Bring some of the fish you've just caught, Jesus told them. So Simon Peter climbed up and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. Even though there were so many, the net was not torn. Come and have breakfast, Jesus told them. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, he took the bread, and he gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. What a night this must have been for these guys. 7 of the 11 current disciples are present, and they're all professional fishermen. That's what they did before they met Jesus. And what do you do when you're just confused and unsure? Sometimes you just return to what you know. So Peter says, I'm going fishing. And the rest of the guys are like, hey, well, we're coming along with you. But even though they're professionals, here's the thing. They didn't catch anything, not even one fish all night long. This is not normal for guys that make their living by fishing. But maybe they're sitting there and the night's rolling on and they're just thinking about the events of the preceding days. What have they just seen happen over the course of the last week, right? This triumphal entry, Jesus riding in on a donkey, this expectation of a new kingdom. But then things take a turn and they don't go according to plan, at least not the plan that the disciples thought things should be going with. Jesus is betrayed by one of them, by a trusted friend, Judas. And they watch Peter, kind of their leader, the guy out in front, the loud one, deny that he even knew who Jesus was 3 different times. And they watch Jesus put on a cross, crucified, and killed, buried, put into a tomb, but then resurrected 3 days later. That's what we looked at last week in the story of Easter. And up to this point, they've seen the resurrected Jesus twice. And the night is rolling on and they're not catching any fish. Like, man, we can't even be fishermen anymore. They just had to be confused, just kind of unsure about the future, feeling a little bit lost. Maybe you felt like that. It's just things are swirling around all around you and thoughts are going through your mind and you just feel unsure. What does the future hold? What is happening? But then for the disciples, Jesus shows up, quite literally. They don't know that it's him, but he calls out, "Try the other side of the boat." And sure enough, they do, and something only God could do happened. John seems to be the first person to recognize what's going on here, and he calls out, "Well, that's Jesus." And Peter has a Peter response, doesn't he? I mean, you feel like you kind of get to know Peter, and you could just kind of predict, of all the disciples, if anybody was just going to jump out of the boat and race to the guy on the shore, you knew it would be Peter. Yeah, I would expect that from him. Sometimes you might have people in your life, like you know the situation and you know the person and you can predict how they're going to respond. I had something like that happen to me this week, although I wasn't proud of it. I like my Diet Coke. I like drinking my Diet Coke in the morning if the Diet Coke is from McDonald's. And so quite often on my way to work, I'll stop at the drive-thru and get a couple of large Diet Cokes. And then, if it's my day off or something, I might swing. If I'm running some errands, I'll swing through, grab some Diet Cokes. And I always think enough people go through the McDonald's line that they probably don't remember everybody that comes through, right? Except for the other day, first time this has happened. Well, not the first time this has happened at any McDonald's, but the first time it had happened at this McDonald's in New York, I'm embarrassed to admit. But I got into the drive-through line and, I pull up and the lady comes over the speaker. First thing she says, "Are you here for your Diet Cokes?" Yeah. They knew who I was and they could predict my response because of my past behavior. Peter has a response that's kind of predictable, right? Peter jumps into the water and heads back. He kind of leaves the rest of the guys to take care of the work. I mean, they had just caught 153 fish, and I'm sure they're struggling to get the nets in and get it into the boats. And Peter's like, "Hey, you guys can deal with that. I'm heading in to see Jesus." The rest of the guys come and gather on shore, and Jesus has fixed a breakfast for them. And they find bread and fish cooked over a charcoal fire, John tells us. And here's what happens next, verse 15. When they had eaten breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And Jesus is probably referring to the other disciples there. "Do you love me more than these other disciples?" "Yes, Lord," he said to them. "You know that I love you. Feed my lambs," he told him. A second time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Well, yes, Lord," he said to him. "You know that I love you." "Shepherd my sheep," he told him. He asked him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was grieved that he had asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." "Feed my sheep," Jesus said. "Truly I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go." He said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. After saying this, he told him, "Follow me." Peter had, at least probably up to this point, viewed himself as the model of love and loyalty for Jesus. In his mind, he probably felt like he set the standard. He was the example to follow. You remember what he told Jesus before the crucifixion? Jesus, even if everybody else abandoned you, I will never do that. Everybody else is here. That's pretty good, but I'm here. I mean, that would kind of match Peter's personality, right? I mean, talk about the predicted responses. That would make sense with the way we have seen Peter operate. Earlier in John's Gospel, Peter had said that they would follow Jesus because there was nowhere else to go and there was no one else worth following. Peter attempts to defend Jesus with the sword, and Peter does make an attempt to follow Jesus after his arrest. But then there's no mention of Peter at the cross. We don't hear about him again until the morning of the resurrection. And Peter, in his mind, is maybe setting the standard for loyalty, but Jesus is about to confront that idea with a hard lesson. And he asks Peter, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus asks a second time, and Peter answers a second time in the affirmative. And then Jesus asks a third time, and there's something about this third time that seems to click in Peter's mind. The text tells us that Peter is grieved. He's sad. There's sorrow in his heart at that question having been asked a third time. And they're sitting around this charcoal fire after having not caught anything until the miracle of Jesus. And Peter gets asked a question for the third time. Where had that happened before? Well, you probably know the answer to that. But we laid the groundwork for this back in week 1. The only other place in the Gospel of John that you find mention of a charcoal fire was Peter's denial on the night of the crucifixion. And the second time that John mentions a charcoal fire is here on the shore with Jesus. We talked about a couple of weeks ago how that smell of charcoal burning would now be in Peter's mind after the denial. And every time he would catch that scent, it would remind him of his denial, his failure, of Jesus looking at him. But now, Jesus has set the stage with this charcoal fire where Peter would be forgiven, restored. And now that aroma that would have reminded him of failure will become the sweet smell of forgiveness and mercy. Jesus had poked and prodded at Peter's heart until Peter was forced to face the reality of what had happened before. See, before, Peter had been relying on his own strength. Jesus, even if no one else does, I will never. But in this moment, after his failure and denial, Peter experiences restoration. Peter had failed Jesus, and it was a pretty big failure, if you think about it, right? Think about what was happening on that night. Jesus is dying for Peter. He is giving his life for Peter. The greatest sacrifice anyone can give. And how does Peter repay? He says, I don't even know who that man is. Maybe you've been in the shoes of Peter. Maybe you feel like you failed at times. You've let people down. You've broken your promises. You have failed Jesus. Maybe it's happened more than once. Maybe it's happened a lot for you. But the beauty of the gospel is that you can experience the same forgiveness and restoration that Peter received. Because the gospel says Jesus loves you. The gospel says that Jesus still gave his life for you, even though he knew that you would fail him. The gospel says, quit trying to rely on your own strength, because it doesn't depend on you. It is not held up by you. And it was because of this gospel, it was because of the forgiveness and the restoration that Peter received, that he was called to care for something other than himself. The gospel got him looking outside of his own needs. And Jesus was telling Peter to demonstrate his love for him. Peter, if you love me, take care of others. Feed my sheep. Peter, live a selfless life. Live a life that is not about you. We as Christians should be marked by this. We should be marked by our care and love and concern for one another. But notice the order that Jesus is doing things here, not in order to earn the forgiveness of Jesus, but because we have been given the forgiveness of Jesus. Just living a selfless life that Jesus has now called Peter to do, and by extension calls us as Christ followers to do. If we're going to succeed in this, there's a few things we need to remember. Jesus gives us a few things to keep in the front of our mind. Look at some of these things that Jesus told Peter in this narrative. First, Jesus said, in essence, you do it for me. If you printed an outline off the website now, as when we're finally beginning to take notes, you do it for me. We've already established we do these things because we love Jesus, right? It's how we show our love for him. But notice that 3 different times Jesus said, take care of my sheep. Who owns the sheep? Well, Jesus does. As Christians, God has entrusted to us the care and well-being of one another. But we can't forget who we really belong to. They're not my sheep. They're not your sheep. They're God's sheep. And the way that we care for one another, being God's sheep, is a direct indication of how we feel about our Savior. If you love me, you will feed my sheep. Our faithfulness is measured by our feeding. Jesus gives us a second idea here. He said, you can't do it without me. Now, let's go back to the fish story for a minute. The disciples were not fishermen who were beginners, right? These guys weren't amateurs. This wasn't just a hobby for them. It'd be one thing if I, as a beginner fisherman, would go out and not catch anything. But these guys were experts. This is how they made their living. And on that night, they did what they knew best, catching fish, only to turn up empty. Not a single fish. Can you imagine their frustration? Probably tired, cranky, the sun's starting to come up, which means their day is about to end. And here comes this voice from a guy on the shore. They don't know who it is. You don't have any fish, do you? I don't know what the disciples' response was, but I know what my response might have been. I'm like, who is this guy? Yeah, go away. Don't bother us. But then the voice takes the next step to call out and try to tell them how to do it. Give the experts some advice. I'll just throw the net on the other side. You ever been in a situation where you've witnessed that? You've seen people try to give advice to the experts. I mean, they're experts for a reason, right? We've got a lot of people in our church that work with horses. I don't know the first thing about working with horses, right? So you need advice, you need help on working with horses. There's other people you're going to go to before me. In fact, I probably should be like at the end of the line. There's one lady in our church named Jean. She works with horses every day. That's her job. She is an expert when it comes to horses. And I would imagine part of her job is working with horses and getting them ready to ride so that other people can take rides on these horses. And just imagine, maybe there's a horse that she's really struggling to work with to get it ready. And she's got it out there in the, I don't even know what they call it a ring or something, out there in the ring, working with this horse, trying to get it ready to ride. And suddenly I just show up, right? I just show up and I kind of lean against the fence. Oh, it's not going good, huh? And she'd roll her eyes at me. I mean, Jean's always very gracious, but she might roll her eyes at me a little bit. I'm like, well, just try petting it more. Like, who is this guy? Who is he to tell me, the expert, how to do this? Now, I don't know what the disciples were thinking, but they might have thought too, well, you know what? We've got nothing else to lose. We haven't caught anything, so they do. They try throwing the net's on the other side, and they catch 153 fish. So many fish, it's a miracle. So many fish that John immediately realized what's happening here, and he said, only Jesus could have done that. You know what's so hard about living a selfless life? It's because it's so easy to live a selfish one, isn't it? We become experts on selfish living all on our own. Nobody has to teach us how to be selfish. If instant gratification is your ultimate goal, you'll succeed on your own strength. You can do it on your own. You'll become the expert, self-promotion or self-preservation or self-indulgence. If those were events, we could win the gold medal all by ourselves. But on the other hand, if you want to give up your personal comfort for someone else's eternal benefit, their eternal good, your effort is not enough. If you want to be intentional about being a godly wife and a contented mother, you'll fail on your own strength. If you want to be a father who strives to make sure that his family, his wife, doesn't just get his leftovers at the end of the day, you're going to fail on your own. If you want to be a coworker or a classmate who shines the light of Christ into their surroundings, you're going to come up short if you rely on yourself. If you desire to conquer that area of sin that constantly plagues you, your best intentions and desire will fall short. And all of the good that you do will be empty and short-lived apart from the effective power of Jesus Christ working in and through you. That's why this fish story is so encouraging. Right? If we follow Christ when we live the selfless life, we don't need to rely on our own strength. In fact, as Peter experienced, you can't rely on your own strength. God will provide exactly what we need, exactly when we need it. There's a reason those guys didn't catch any fish. Right? They were in their comfort zone. They were experts in what they were doing. They had all the confidence in the world that they could catch fish, but they caught nothing. Why? So that Jesus' power could be demonstrated in that moment. But do you think they realized that when their nets kept coming up empty? Like when it was happening, do you think that's what was going through their mind? Oh, what about you? Right? You maybe have experienced seasons of frustration that last for days or weeks or months or maybe even years when it feels as if you're failing. You're coming up short. You may be trying to follow Jesus and do what he says, yet you feel as if everything is just going wrong. And to make it even harder, you don't even see the purpose of why things are happening the way that they are. And it may not be revealed until much later, if ever, that we discover the reason for what we are going through. But it is in those times that the object of our trust will be revealed. Are we trusting in ourselves, in our own strength to get us through, or are we trusting in Jesus to give us what we need when we need it? Are you trusting in yourself, in your limited power, your finite knowledge, your feeble strength that will eventually fail you? Or are you trusting in the all-powerful, all-knowing, almighty God who has already proven himself victorious once and for all time? You know, the disciples failed at what they knew best. They had all the reason in the world to trust in their own strength when it came to catching fish. They were right where their confidence was. But Jesus used that to show them, you can't do it without me. I am here to do things through you that only I can do. And Jesus gives them a third thing to think about. He said, you do it with me. In verse 18, Jesus tells Peter that he's not in for a comfortable life. He tells him that eventually he's going to suffer death at the hands of someone else. He's going to be bound, taken where he doesn't want to go against his will, and killed. God has called you to do some things. God has called you to maybe experience suffering, to be uncomfortable in all sorts of ways, unknown ways, scary ways, ways that no one else around you seems to be going through, ways that feel too insurmountable, too long, too rough. Ways in which you might feel surrounded by the enemy. But Jesus ends with these two words, follow me. I spent some time this week just thinking about those two words, follow me. What's captured there? Let me give you three things and then we're going to bring it to a close. When Jesus says, follow me, he means Jesus is going with you. Follow me. We're going to go into this together. Jesus wants you to know that you aren't going to get left behind. He's thought of you, what you need. He's prepared. He's the guide. Jesus is going with you. You're in this together. And when Jesus says, follow me, it means Jesus is going in front of you. Right? I'll take the lead. Follow me. You get right behind me. Jesus is saying, I'll be your fortress. I'll be your shield. I'll be your protector. I'll be your defender. You follow me. You get right behind me. And our job is just to stay behind him. Focus our eyes on him. Allow him to lead the way. And finally, when he says, follow me, it's saying Jesus knows where he is going. Right? Hey, follow me. I know the way. I'll be your guide. I know the reasons we're on this journey. I know where our destination is. Just follow me. You ever felt lost in life? I was in a situation last week. My mom went into the hospital for just a few hours. She needed to get some fluids, and I was pretty concerned for her. And it was Easter Sunday in the afternoon. She had got admitted into a room, and I knew the room number, but I went into the wrong entrance. And it's Easter Sunday afternoon, so there weren't a lot of people around, didn't seem to be. And I kind of got turned around. I didn't know the hospital super well, and I know the entrance I'd come in, but then I discovered that was not the right entrance, and I was wandering through, and I didn't know where I was in the hospital. I wasn't concerned for my safety or anything like that, but I was in a hurry to get to the room to see my mom and see how she was doing. So I would stop at all of the little junctions and kind of look around and try to get my bearings and get any sign of where it was that I needed to go, because I wasn't even sure I could find my way back out at this point. And I obviously must have looked pretty lost. There really weren't many people around, but this one person happened to come by that worked at the hospital, and it's, where are you going? I said, oh, glad you're here. Here's the room number I'm looking for. My mom's there, and I've gotten turned around. She said, not a problem. I'll take you there. Follow me. Boy, the relief that was to have somebody that knew the way. Said, I know we need to turn here. We're going to go that way, through these doors. We'll get you where you're going. And when Jesus says, follow me, he's saying, I'll go with you. And I'm going to go in front of you, and I know where we're going. We started by asking the question, what did Jesus think about Peter after his failure? Or maybe that's why John kept going in chapter 21, so that we could know. And what happens when we fail? And Jesus is telling us here that we are called to something more. That we're going to fail. But we're called to something much bigger than ourselves. Something so big, we can't do it on our own. And we will fail just like Peter did. And like Peter, we'll trust in our own strength. Maybe because we're in an environment where we think we've got the expertise, we've got the confidence to succeed, only to fall short. But when that happens, like Peter, we'll find forgiveness. We will find restoration. We'll find the same mercy and grace that Peter did, not only in the forgiveness, but in the power of Jesus, giving us exactly what we need, exactly when we need it, so that when it happens, we'll look at our lives and we'll say, the only explanation is, that's Jesus. Jesus says, follow me. That's his promise to you. And we've seen that Jesus keeps his promises.